Today's sermon by Janet Cooper is titled, "To Sit in Silence, Unraveling the Riddle of India." Janet?
Thank you, Andy. A riddle within a riddle that defies understanding. That is a line from my poem that I read earlier. It describes how almost everyone in our traveling Sangha felt after our travels through India. We were stunned and dismayed by the extreme poverty and chaos, the apparent lack of any civic pride, and the evidence of massive government corruption. But simultaneously, we all felt the luminous glow of deep inner peace and connection that arose out of our daily practice that involved Dharma talks and meditation. We practiced silent meditations, sitting meditations, and silent meals, the latter by far the least popular meditation in our group. Everyone ended the tour baffled by the contradictions that India presents to the first-time visitor. I wrote this sermon in an attempt to throw some light on contemporary Indian life by doing a little background research into India's history. 21st century India is a country of 1.3 billion people, all living in an area 1/3 the size of the United States. It contains 30% of the world's poor. When traveling through the country, both in the cities and the countryside, you are rarely unaware of their presence. We were all touched and very disturbed by the presence of children and disabled people begging in the streets. Malnourished animals scavenging for something to eat from piles of trash, and the makeshift shelters constructed out of discarded materials that house the migrant workers and their families. The state of the environment, both natural and man-made, was also a shock. In the countryside, the small farmers worked dusty fields, made increasingly unproductive with the advent of Western fertilizers and pesticides. The air was thick with heavy smog, the result of farmers burning their fields, families cooking their evening meals over burning cow dung, and coal-fired power plants' exhaust. The cities and towns were strangled in heavy chaotic traffic, and the roadways were lined with mountains of litter. The entire population is in grave risk due to both environmental destruction and climate change. Over much of the Indian subcontinent, rapidly increasing average temperatures are soon expected to exceed maximum wet bulb temperatures at which humans can survive. We wondered, how is it possible that a civilization that produced the world's most insightful religious traditions has also produced this degree of social dystopia? Why is India, a country steeped in deep spirituality and mindfulness, also home to such misery and squalor? The director of our tour, Shantam Seth, who is a close friend of Thich Nhat Hanh and practices in the Plum Village tradition, provided some valuable insight. The majority of Indians are Hindu, and most Hindus believe that their souls exist over the course of many lifetimes, and the circumstances of each new reincarnation is based on how well past lives were conducted. If you did bad things in your past life, you will be born into very reduced circumstances in your current life. Your only hope of improving future lives is to willingly accept whatever hardships you now face. Although this provides a degree of social stability, it also allows great social injustices to continue generation after generation. But what else happened to bring India to its current unenviable state as a modern-day dystopia? To complete our inquiry, we must take a look at India's history. 4,500 years ago, Indian civilization, known as the Indus or Harappan period, was extremely advanced. It was peaceful and had no elite or depressed classes. It was a prosperous society with great civic efficiency. During this period, yoga and the meditative traditions were first practiced. India continued to prosper during the following Mauryan to Gupta periods. During this time, we see continued spiritual and material growth. Large universities were built hosting multiple religious traditions. There was an artistic explosion, and shipping, metallurgy, and textile production all came into prominence. India's economy represented 33% of the worldwide economy, while Europe came in at 13%. This golden age was ended following repeated Muslim invasions that exhausted India. Hard on the heels of the Muslim invaders, the British East India Company's takeover of the country represented, in the words of Will Durant, an American writer, historian, and philosopher who published in the mid-20th century, quote, the most sordid and criminal exploitation of one nation by another in all of recorded history, end quote. The British government took over during the colonial period that lasted from 1757 to 1947. This period was also known as the Raj. Another kind of destruction was now taking place, that of native industries, crafts, administrative functions, education, and medical systems. The denigration and destruction of all things native to India left the country in a sorry state following independence in 1947. But let's take a step back and review what Indian society gifted to the world before the repeated invasions and subsequent 200-year colonization took away her spirit. Most of us are unaware of the contributions of India to Western civilization. India's advances in science and mathematics were astonishing and only adopted much later by Europeans. By the 5th century BCE, Indian scholars had identified an accurate value for pi, understood the extraction of square and cube roots, developed trigonometry, calculated the size of the Earth, which was known to be spherical, understood the Earth's rotation, and recorded the planet's orbits and lunar eclipses. Indian scholars understood the infinite well and ascribed the solar system as endlessly pulsating, ceaselessly destroyed and recreated. Carl Sagan noted, quote, the Hindu religion is the only one of the world's great faiths dedicated to the idea that the cosmos itself undergoes an immense, indeed an infinite, number of deaths and rebirths. It is the only religion in which the time scales correspond to those of modern scientific cosmology, end quote. There was no rigid boundary between science and spirituality in the minds of Indian mathematicians. Ancient Indian savants were also aware of the fact that the earth and air all swarm with living organisms, what we today call microbes and germs. And they were aware of this in spite of the fact that microscopes did not exist. Ancient Indians were also aware of the principle of evolution of forms supporting an evolution of consciousness. Lord Vishnu is represented by 10 incarnations, starting as a fish and becoming increasingly complex organisms until his final incarnation as a man. No other culture has presented a more striking allegory. The fascinating theme that runs continually through ancient Indian culture is the love of infinity and eternity, and of being aware that their musings on truth and the nature of reality are, as Aryabhata, an Indian mathematician from the 5th century, writes in his verse, mere boats on the sea of true knowledge. To quote Will Durant again, India was the motherland of our race, and Sanskrit the mother of Europe's languages. She was the mother of our philosophy, mother through the Arabs of much of our mathematics, mother through Buddha of the ideals embodied in Christianity, mother through the village community of self-government and democracy. Mother India is in many ways mother of us all, end quote. Although Western scholars have reduced many of India's achievements to footnotes in the Greek and Mesopotamian cultures, her contributions in the fields of spirituality and religion and philosophy are widely known. Yoga and meditation are widespread in the West. Notions of rebirth and karma are part of the New Age movement. Buddhism is the fastest growing religion in France and Australia. India remains a reference point for seekers who cannot be satisfied by dogmatic systems. India's best known gift to the world is the experiential and verifiable method of self-exploration and self-fulfillment called yoga. Another interesting element of Indian history was that India never imposed her ideas or culture on any nation by military force. D.P. Singhal, Indian scholar and historian, wrote, quote, the expansion of Indian culture is a monument to human understanding and cultural cooperation, the outcome of a voluntary quest for learning, end quote. There were no conquests or invasions, no forced conversions. Indian ideas were adopted because others found them useful and insightful. The peaceful nature of Indian society ultimately came out of Hindu theology that forcefully states that all of nature is imbued with divinity. The biblical gulf between the creator and the created has no place in India. The reverence for all creatures and life forms has no equivalent in Western history. But now that we've explored a brief account of Indian accomplishments, we are faced with the sad reality of today. Indians still labor under the colonial notion that all useful knowledge, all real progress, and civilization comes out of the West. India's educational systems have failed to move out of the model left behind by the British that glorifies the West and ignores India's own history and achievements. To more fully understand India's current state of brokenness, we also need to look at her history. After independence, the country embarked on a hybrid experiment of Western utilitarianism and Soviet industrialization, all the while operating under a huge bureaucratic structure that was unwieldy, ineffectual, and corrupt. Forest departments destroyed forests to make way for commercial crops and spent more funds on expanding bureaucracies than on protecting forests. Policymakers ignored the enormous potential of alternative energy sources and blindly promoted huge dams and massive nuclear power plants and factories. Natural resources were no longer a gift to be wisely used, but objects to be exploited. After the Raj, India was left with a large, educated, anglicized, and partially Christianized ruling class that assumed that India must adopt European thought, science, industry, and socio-political institutions. Western intellectuals' love of divisiveness proved to be the most disastrous import into Indian society. In the West, we love to neatly label and set in contrast our belief systems. You are either a believer or an atheist. Spirit and matter are separated by an abyss. Things are ancient or modern. You are an empiricist or a rationalist. India traditionally recognized and respected the endless multiplicity of approaches to the truth. However, after the influence of the West, different religions became rival sects. Semi-fluid social communities were cataloged by the British rulers as so many iron-clad castes. Sri Aurobindo, an Indian philosopher active in the movement for independence from British rule, wrote, quote, "It is only if we allow Europe to think for us that India is in danger of becoming an ill-executed and foolish copy of Europe," end quote. Part of the fascination with India for the first-time visitor is the unparalleled complexity, a bewildering social, linguistic, and spiritual diversity, and an ancient cultural heritage. Since independence, the phrase wounded was coined by V.S. Naipaul to describe the new Indian identity. India's perception of her own culture is, to this day, still informed by colonial rule, that it is barbaric, stagnant, idolatrous, and caste-ridden. Rabindranath Tagore wrote in 1903, quote, "We are obliged to learn a brand of history that makes our children forget. It appears as if we are nobody in India, as if those who came from the outside alone matter," end quote. Another element in contemporary Indian societal ills is the presence of Christian missionaries who work tirelessly across the country to bring converts into the church. They promise cash rewards, free tuition to Christian schools, free medical care at Christian centers, and have been reasonably successful in converting lower and middle-class Hindus. They encourage their converts to separate from their old lives and family structures, and have succeeded in creating a large subset of alienated and disenfranchised people. The missionaries also promote propaganda against the local religious traditions, creating tensions in local communities. So in closing, we have located a few pieces to the intricate puzzle that is modern-day India, a unique country with a rich past and a historically advanced understanding of science and religious philosophy. India is desperately attempting to elevate herself from centuries of brutal outside rule and the subsequent denigration of her culture. We have found that the Hindu philosophy of karma has contributed to the lack of resistance to the massive corruption and incompetence that are the hallmarks of their present-day government. We have also discovered that India's traditional culture is worth saving and further exploring. This interest is already played out in the visits of religious programs and spiritual seekers from around the world who come to India to draw closer to the truth about our existence on Earth and the meaning of our lives. When we visit India as representatives of Western culture, let us explore with a sense of reverence. Let us try to reach into the deep well of wisdom that Mother India offers to every visitor to her shores, and more importantly, support those amongst the Indian population striving to make India once again a beacon of gentle understanding and human cooperation. As Swami Vivekananda wrote, "Take care of India's soul, and the rest will take care of itself." Thank you.